Welcome back to my channel, guys. Today what I'm going to be talking about is the most interesting teams to watch in MLS in 2019. Please make sure you like the video if you end up enjoying the video and subscribe if you want to see more MLS content from me. The first team is Vancouver Whitecaps FC. They're a very interesting team to watch this season as they had a major rebuild where they got rid of 21 players on their team. Some of the most notable players they got rid of were Kai Kamara, Christian Teixeira, Kendall Waston. Let's not forget Alphonso Davies, and 18 players arrived for their team, including their 3 new designated players, including Hwang In-beom, who's a South Korean midfielder, who's a young designated player, and Fredy Montero, who played in 2017 for Vancouver Whitecaps. He's not a young designated player. And then there's this new Uruguayan forward who is a young designated player for them. I'll be honest, watching the first game that Vancouver played versus Minnesota United, they weren't the most interesting team to watch. The only chances they seemed to get were long shots, but it's so interesting because of their rebuild. I wasn't completely sold on Hwang In-beom, but I heard that he apparently played quite well in the second game, and you can see the skills that he has and the reason why he came over to Vancouver Whitecaps in the first place, and that he has a fairly big skill set. And on the other hand, then there's also Fredy Montero, who's got a good aerial ability, which always threw me off as he's not the tallest of players, but he has such a good aerial ability. He's good at heading, so he'll be certainly interesting to see how he'll perform for Vancouver this season, and if he performs as well as the 2017 season, which, to be honest, was an okay season. It wasn't amazing, but it was a fairly decent season for a designated player. They've also made other interesting signings that aren't as high profile, as they signed Eric Godoy, who's an Argentinian center back, on loan, so hopefully he'll be able to shore up that defense. And then they also signed Maxime Crepeau, who I believe started in the first game of the season versus Minnesota United, and he was one of the best goalkeepers in USL last season, as he was the goalkeeper for Ottawa Fury on loan from Montreal Impact. And then there's Lucas Venuto, who actually I quite like just from seeing this one run that he had was versus Minnesota, and it was a pretty good run. He seems like a pretty fast player, very good at dribbling. So I think he could be a quite good player for that team. He's a winger, and I believe you should watch out for him. And let's not forget, one of the biggest signings that they've had this season is their new manager in Marc Dos Santos, a Canadian manager. Most recently was the assistant manager for LAFC. This is the first head coach job that he's taking on for an MLS team, as he was only, as I just said, an assistant manager for LAFC. I wonder how he'll get on in MLS. It hasn't been a particularly amazing start for him, but I hope for the best, as he's a Canadian, as I'm a Canadian myself, so I hope that he'll be very good for that team. Next up, we have Minnesota United. They also had a bit of a rebuild as 15 players departed, and they signed 7 new players, and there's some pretty notable players out of the players that they've signed. They signed Osvaldo Alonso, who's a solid central midfielder who can operate in that defensive midfielder role, which he's been foreseeing as he's played for Minnesota United. And they also signed Iko Para, who was the 2017 MLS Defender of the Year, played very well for them last season as well, so it will be good to see how he'll perform for them, as he's performed pretty well for them so far, along with Osvaldo Alonso. It will be interesting to see how well he'll be able to improve that Minnesota United defense, as really the only way that they can go is up from last season in terms of their defense, and in terms of their defense for the past few seasons, as in 2017 and 2018. They both had a horrible defense, but it looks like they'll improve from that, as they've only conceded 2 goals in their first 2 games, and they've scored 6 goals. Darwin Quintero scoring 2 goals and assisting 3 of those, which is pretty amazing. He'll be able to compete for the MLS MVP this season, I believe, and I believe he's one of the best players in the league. He's a very exciting player to watch. and I hope that he can continue on his form because I always have fun watching him, especially when he attempts to chip the goalkeeper, which, as we saw last year, he sometimes succeeds at. Sure hope he doesn't succeed whenever he plays against Toronto FC, my team, as he last season chipped Clint Irwin twice in one game, which was pretty embarrassing for him. I also forgot to mention that they signed Victor Manone from Championship side Reading. He used to play for Sunderland as well, and they signed a player named Romain Métanire, who had one of the best passes of last week's games, where he passed the ball all the way down the field. And I believe, I can't remember actually who got on the end of the ball, but they ended up getting the shot saved. But it was an amazing pass to that player, and I mean, if they had pass of the week in MLS, that would be one of them. And of course, Adrian Heath is still their manager. He's in his third season with Minnesota. It looks like, in my opinion, that was a good option. It was a good decision to keep him at the club for these years, as, I mean, we don't want something as similar like Orlando Tire Fire that happened last season, where they've just gone through so many managers, including Adrian Heath, and now they're really not, they don't look like a playoff contender still. Anyway, Minnesota looks like they're rebounding from their 2 seasons that weren't the greatest, and hopefully for them, they'll be able to do better. Now we have LAFC, who are clear MLS Cup and Supporters Shield contenders, which Supporters Shield is just the league table. Whoever finishes top of the league table wins the Supporters Shield. That's basically the MLS name for it, and a trophy for whatever team wins it. They had a very good year in their expansion year, as they finished 5th out of 23 teams. I believe Atlanta, who's believed to have one of the best expansion years, competing with Chicago Fire's 1998 year, where they won the MLS Cup and the US Open Cup in the same year. I mean, they finished 4th, so LAFC's competing with Atlanta's expansion year, which is quite amazing. They've had some major exits from the team, as they've got rid of Benny Feilhaber, who moved on to Colorado Rapids on a free, and they also moved on their #1 draft pick in Joel Moutinho, who, a left back, moves on to Orlando City, as Mohamed El Munir moves the other way to LAFC. In terms of their major signings, of course, El Munir, I think, is a major signing for them. And then they also signed Rodolfo Zelaya. I'm sorry if I said that name wrong, but he came from a Central American team, and he's a forward, so he's adding to their already crowded list of forwards on their team. But I believe the story is more about the players that they currently have instead of the players that they signed, as they have Carlos Vela, Diego Rossi, and there's a bit of a competition between Adama Diomande and Christian Ramirez for that center forward position. So their forward is arguably the best offensive unit in the league. They have pretty good players in every position on the field. They also have a great manager in Bob Bradley, who's very versatile and has built a good team, and has built one of the best expansion teams in MLS history, behind his Chicago Fire team in 1998. So now for the 4th team, FC Cincinnati. Of course, I couldn't forget to put FC Cincinnati in this list, as they're the only expansion team this year, a team from Ohio. Their manager is Alan Coach from their USL side, their USL FC Cincinnati side, and he was able to achieve certain things like being the 2018 MLS regular season champion. So he didn't win the playoffs, but he was the top team, finished the top in all of USL in terms of the league table. He was the 2018 USL Coach of the Year, and he also, we can't forget about how he got that FC Cincinnati side to finish semi-finalists in the US Open Cup in 2017, which is very amazing for any USL side. So of course, since they're an expansion team, they did have quite a bit of a rebuild from their USL side, but they did sign some of their USL players like Emmanuel Ledesma and Corbin Bone, but they also signed marquee players like Fernando Adi, who hasn't scored for them yet, and they've signed Kendall Waston, who's a center back for them and was the captain of Vancouver Whitecaps. They also signed players like Kenny Saif, who is a midfielder coming from Anderlecht. There's a lot of hype around him. And we also can't forget Leonardo Bertone, who scored FC Cincinnati's first goal in their MLS era He's an Argentinian playmaker. In terms of their performances on the field so far, they didn't start off the greatest. Versus Seattle Sounders, they lost 4-1 to them at CenturyLink Field. It was slightly disappointing. I mean, it was at CenturyLink Field in front of like 40,000 fans. And then they went on to Atlanta United at Mercedes-Benz Stadium, one of the hardest venues to play at in the league. And they ended up tying them 1-1, which left a lot of fans very angry on the Atlanta United side. From what I've watched of them, they haven't really been able to keep possession, but they've been able to play decently with the small amount of possession that they've had and the small amount of chances that they've had. I mean, I watched them versus Seattle for part of the game, and they didn't have much possession, but they were able to score a goal, I would say, against the run of play, and then they were able to score a goal against Atlanta United despite Atlanta having more of the possession, at least from what I saw. I haven't looked at the statistics, but both games it seems like they didn't seem to be able to hold their possession well, which they could work on, but they're good at taking their chances. They have a good defensive pairing, good physical and aerial presence in their central defender pairing, as they have Kendall Waston from Vancouver, and they also have Nick Hegland from Toronto FC, who, as I've watched over the years, he's pretty strong and he's very good in the air. He scored a few goals for Toronto FC from headers. That people should watch out for him when he's in the box, because he's pretty good at scoring as well as Kendall Waston. For the last team, this is a bit unexpected if you haven't been watching the actual games in MLS and you've been more looking at the score lines. In Chicago Fire. Chicago Fire haven't made any particularly amazing signings this season. Their squad doesn't look the greatest. I watched the game versus LA Galaxy, and I can tell you that Chicago Fire outplayed LA Galaxy, in my opinion, because they were getting a tremendous amount of chances, and LA Galaxy fairly took their chances. Good for them that they took their chances, but I mean, the Chicago Fire defense isn't the greatest, but their offense looks good despite them not having the most amazing players. I mean, they have Alexander Katai, who's a quality player as he proved last year. They have Mihailovic, who came back after his almost the whole season long injury. He came back in late 2018 but wasn't able to make much of an impact on their season as he came so late. But he's been playing well for them. And then they have this Frankowski guy who's new to their team, and he's been playing quite well for them as well. So I think it looks more positive than I originally saw Chicago Fire performing this season. So I believe that the outlook is exciting, but they need to finish their chances. CJ Sapong has been the only guy, he just arrived around 2 weeks ago. He's been the only guy that's been able to finish the chances for Chicago Fire. And Nemanja Nikolic, who historically speaking, as we've looked in the past, he's been able to finish the chances, but in the last game where he played against Orlando City, he wasn't able to finish the chances. So, I mean, that's going to be the thing that will determine how well Chicago Fire's attack plays this season, at least on paper. They also have a new goalkeeper in David Ousted. He played for DC United last year. He played for Vancouver Whitecaps for a few years before then. He's a good goalkeeper. He had one of the saves of the season, in my opinion, versus LA Galaxy. That was an amazing save that he had. So despite only gathering 1 point, just barely 1 point, I mean, they scored, CJ Sapong scored in stoppage time versus Orlando to deny them of the 3 points. So they got a point off of Orlando. But despite that 1 point only in 2 games, so 0.5 points per game, they look more positive than their results are suggesting. So I think you should watch out for them. I mean, I found they were a pretty entertaining team to watch when they played against LA Galaxy. Anyway, thank you for watching this long video. If you enjoyed it, please like the video. If you want to see more MLS content from me, please subscribe. And until next time, see ya.